Hi students. Alright, today we are on our second to last lecture of BIOL-11 lab, and we're going to be covering the cardiovascular system. So we left off last week discussing the respiratory and digestive systems and how they function in animals to bring in oxygen and nutrients and expel carbon dioxide and other waste. The circulatory system is responsible for shuttling oxygen and nutrients from the lungs and digestive system to all the cells of the body, and to then shuttle waste and carbon dioxide out of the body. The urinary system also plays a role here in removing waste from the body, and we're going to discuss that a little bit next week. The main organ that enables this distribution system is the heart. So this muscular organ is located in the center of the thoracic cavity. It's nestled in between the two lungs, and it's connected to a convoluted network of blood vessels comprised of arteries, veins, and capillaries. So as a general rule, when we're looking at diagrams like this, arteries carry oxygen-rich blood from the heart to other parts of the body, and so they're traditionally drawn in red, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes. Veins return deoxygenated blood, or oxygen-poor blood, to the heart. They return blood to the heart, and these are traditionally drawn in blue. So blood makes two circuits, or sometimes you might also think of this as a figure 8 circuit. I actually think thinking of this as a figure 8 is a little bit more helpful. But there are two loops to this figure 8 circuit. So the first loop of this circuit is the pulmonary circuit. Veins return blood carrying carbon dioxide from the body, which is then pumped by the heart to the lungs. The carbon dioxide is dispelled and oxygen is taken up by the blood in the lungs, and then it is returned to the heart. And then it enters into the second circuit, or the second loop of the figure 8 circuit, the systemic circuit. This blood, which now contains oxygen-rich blood, this blood, which now contains more oxygen, is pumped into the next loop, which is known as the systemic circuit. And this blood travels through blood vessels all throughout the body, and drops off oxygen and nutrients in the cells. So why do we use blue and red here, and why, if you have fair skin or fair enough skin, your veins can sometimes appear blue or purple or green, depending on your skin tone. So why is this? So this is a result of an interesting characteristic of the molecule known as hemoglobin. So hemoglobin gives red blood cells their color. It is also a really important part of the blood vessels because the iron atoms in the heme group that are on this protein actually bind to oxygen molecules, and this is how these red blood cells are able to physically carry oxygen to the rest of the body. So when hemoglobin binds to this oxygen molecule, it actually undergoes a conformational change. If you remember this from our study of enzymes, this is a change in the shape of the molecules. So this conformational change happens when it binds to an oxygen molecule, which then changes the color. It changes the shape and it changes the color. So normally when these red blood cells are low in oxygen, it's sort of a dull reddish maroon, which we just sort of denote as blue, even though it's not truly blue. Our blood is red. And then there's a brilliant bright red when this molecule is bound to oxygen. So just for ease, we use blue and red to denote veins and arteries when we draw diagrams of the cardiovascular system. Just to help us solidify what kind of blood, what is the oxygen content of this blood, since that's a very important concept to follow. So, we discussed gas exchange last week as it occurs at the intersection of the respiratory and circulatory systems. Remember, we talked about the alveoli and how oxygen and carbon dioxide are passing across these membranes into and out of the lungs. And this is also happening everywhere else in the body, because this gas exchange is also happening at the cellular level, levels of the tissues in the body. They also need to exchange gases. So, we have structures known as capillary beds. This is actually where the arteries just become smaller and smaller and actually physically connect to the veins. So it's very, very tiny, as you see here in this diagram. So this is where we have the small membranes of the cells, and it's easier for these substances to diffuse or be transported across these membranes. So we talk a lot about oxygen and carbon dioxide because that's important for respiration, but we also learned that the digestive system breaks down substances like protein and carbohydrates into its subunits like amino acids and glucose. So these are also carried across these capillary beds. So it's gas exchange and also nutrient exchange and waste exchange. So a little bit more on the structure of the heart, since this is the most important organ of this entire system. Its basic structure is a four-chambered organ. It has two atria, a right and a left, and two ventricles, also a right and a left. The atria are on the top part of the heart, and they're actually smaller, and the ventricles are at the bottom part of the heart, and they're much more muscular. You could see this depicted here just through the layers of the pink muscle. So, these atria and ventricles are also separated by valves, which helps to prevent backflow of blood. Backflow is not going to be good. You don't really want deoxygenated blood flowing back into the body. So the vena cava is the largest vein in the body. All blood returning from the body enters into the vena cava, basically dumped into this giant vessel before the blood enters the right atrium of the heart. From there, it passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. So from the right ventricle, the blood enters the only artery that carries deoxygenated blood in the entire body, the pulmonary artery. This blood travels through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. We have gas exchange take place, and now the blood is oxygenated. This oxygenated blood returns to the heart through the pulmonary vein, which is also the only vein that carries oxygenated blood in the body. This oxygenated rich blood enters the left atrium, and then it passes through the mitral valve and into the left ventricle. The left ventricle is actually the most muscular part of the heart, and this kind of makes sense because its contraction is going to be the final push that blood gets as it travels from the heart out the aorta to the rest of the body. So the aorta is the largest artery in the body. So this pumping motion that the heart uses to basically push blood through it and through these blood vessels is actually what we feel when we feel our heartbeat. We can also feel the pulse, and the pulse is just a deferred result of that heartbeat. So each pump of the heart is going to increase the pressure there, and so that's what you actually feel when you feel a pulse at something like your wrist or your neck, not the actual heart. So there are some other major blood vessels that we're also going to have to learn as part of the circulatory system. So the heart itself has some very important blood vessels. As a muscle, the heart is going to need a pretty significant oxygen supply in order to keep this circuit going. So as the aorta exits the heart, the coronary artery is basically the first stop. It branches off immediately and supplies the tissues of the heart with oxygen. The cardiac vein is also the blood vessel that returns that deoxygenated blood to the vena cava. So it dumps right into the vena cava as it enters back into the heart. So these vessels are really important, medically speaking, because these blood vessels are frequently affected by heart disease. So myocardial infarction, or MI, is the clinical term for what's known more commonly as a heart attack. So a heart attack happens when one of the blood vessels of the heart becomes blocked. It's most commonly due to a buildup of plaque in blood vessels. This is why we're all warned to watch our cholesterol levels, because these plaques are basically made up of cholesterol. So I've included a video on Blackboard which explores heart attacks a little bit more. I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. And it's also a good reminder that we should all learn the signs of a heart attack. One of the things that cardiologists say in the treatment of MI or heart attacks is that time is muscle. So what exactly does this mean, and why is it relevant to our lesson today? So this is because the blood supply is cut off to the muscle tissue of the heart, and because it's then robbed of oxygen and nutrients, the muscle tissue actually starts to die. This is depicted here in this diagram as the darkening of the muscle where that blockage is. So this can happen very rapidly. So the heart is constantly pumping, and it has very, very high oxygen demand as a result. So as the cells are deprived of oxygen very quickly, they start to die very quickly. So in order to fix this, cardiovascular surgeons try to prop open the blood vessels with something called a stent. That's depicted in the video. And then in more serious cases, where the blockages are just extensive or there's more than one blockage, surgeons will perform something known as a bypass. So the bypass is where they use blood vessels, usually from, they harvest them, I think, from other parts of the body, usually the thighs, and they reroute blood around this blocked vessel. So it's actually a pretty old procedure. It's been in practice for a long time, and it's very effective. Just a shout out to my 89-year-old grandfather. He's about to celebrate the 25th anniversary of his quadruple bypass, about a month before he turns 90. Love you, Gramps. So a few more important blood vessels that you should learn about are located in the neck. The brain also needs blood to survive, obviously, so these are critically important blood vessels. And they're the next stop off the aorta after the coronary vessels. The body is actually very smart in the way it designs things. The major artery that supplies blood to the head is known as the carotid artery. And conversely, the jugular vein is the major vein that returns blood from the head. The subclavian arteries also are among the first vessels to branch off of the aorta. The subclavian arteries supply the blood to the arms, and then the subclavian veins return blood from the arms. Some other important major blood vessels include the renal artery and the vein, which manage the blood supply to and from the kidneys. We'll discuss how the kidneys work to help remove waste materials from the blood in our next segment when we cover the urinary and the reproductive systems. We also have the iliac arteries and veins, which is the major blood vessel that supply and remove blood to and from the legs. So last week we briefly touched on the liver as one of the organs located in the abdominal cavity. And the liver is an important organ in what is known as the hepatic portal system. So when we ingest food and it's broken down in our stomach and in our digestive system, and it's taken up into the circulatory system as it's absorbed through the intestine, it first travels to the liver. This is something known as first pass metabolism, because basically the liver gets a first pass at the blood in order to filter it before it's circulated back to the heart for distribution for the rest of the body. This helps to avoid us being poisoned, as it can break down toxic substances. That's what the liver does. It can also change substances. So sometimes pharmaceutical companies will design drugs knowing the kind of modifications that are going to happen to it in the liver, and so that it gives it the active form after it passes through the liver. So this kind of metabolism is a little bit slower, and this is why drugs that we take orally take a lot longer to take effect, as opposed to drugs that are injected or inhaled. They don't travel to the liver. They go right to the bloodstream. All right, so here's a picture of the circulatory system in the fetal pig. And this shows all the important blood vessels and structures that we covered today. So you should be able to use this diagram and the dissection video that I posted on Blackboard to complete your manual activities. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great weekend. All right, bye.